Hi, George Durkee with Columbia College and Geography 63, creating a basic map. And in this class, we'll be looking at, well, how to create a basic map. And I have optimistically called this Fun with Maps. And here we'll be looking at how to use ArcGIS Pro, which is the software we'll be using, to gather data off the internet and also create our own, which will have geospatial information that you can put together to create several types of maps. Now, I started as a backcountry ranger, and I mentioned that in our, Canvas, introduce yourself. And so here I am, 1971. We're taking an injured guy down the Nevada Falls Trail in Yosemite. And then 2014, I'm still doing the same thing. I thought, well, maybe at a certain age you could get a sinecure, a quieter job, easier on the body, but alas, that didn't happen. But in 2000 or so, a bunch of us got together to start looking at more effective and efficient ways of using GIS in search and rescue. So in those days, teams would be assigned their search area on a hand drawn paper map. And we would collect clues. They'd write them out in the field and get them to the instant command post or over the radio, whichever. And then they'd be put in a clue log. But unfortunately, with a lot of paper going back and forth and a pretty busy instant command post, clues would occasionally get lost. And when we started looking into this, there had been a couple of searches where important clues did in fact get lost. And so we wanted a better way of keeping track of information, a faster way of getting maps out to teams so that they could actually get out into the field and start searching. So, as I think many of you know anyway, GIS is Geographic Information Systems. And so it uses data that's either geolocated, that is, has coordinate values already embedded, or data that we'll create, and then we'll add spatial coordinates to that data. And then all that's layered together to create whatever it is you want to show. And we'll use symbology, colors, size of symbols, labels, and all that. We'll use it all together on top of a base map. And then, that map as put together will tell your story or make your point. So when you bring up a map on your phone, you're navigating to a place, this is a pretty good representation of your average map. And it's made of layers. And as I said, those are the layers that we'll be bringing in to create maps. So at the top there, it shows transportation, which is roads and trails and things, places of interest, McDonald's or a park or anything like that. It has a point representation, and then data like a label or something associated with that, and then so on and so forth on down to what they call here an image base or your base map. And that's what you layer everything on top of to create your map. There's a phrase, the map is not the territory. But when we create a map, we need to remember that while that's true, our job as GIS nerdlings is to use data that best illustrates what it is we want to say, and that we keep a representation of the territory according to the best and most effective way of doing that. So we have to compromise in the data we use, so it doesn't clutter up or confuse people. And so we just want to emphasize our main points using the aesthetics of symbology, color labels, and placement. So as I said, when you're creating a map, quite often what we're doing is reducing sometimes fairly complex information and data into a graphic. One picture is worth 1,000 words. So here, for instance, is Charles Menard in 1812 drawing the route of the French army going to Moscow. And you can see the width of the line is the size of the army at given points along the way. It's not shown well, but at the bottom here is the temperature, and then also shown are various geographic points, especially river crossings. So on the way out, the army is getting smaller and smaller from attrition or battles as they go. Then in Moscow, winter sets in the famous retreat from Moscow, and then you can just see how the army is just being seriously reduced. And so this was a darn clever illustration of how to reduce data and make it into a very dramatic graphic. And GIS is also used for analysis. So here is an 1854 map in London, and there'd been a cholera outbreak. And at the time, the transmission, the spread of cholera wasn't well understood. Some people said it was spread through the air, sort of a miasma. But John Snow, looking at where the fatalities were from cholera and where the cases were, saw them all clustered. And he eventually traced it down to a water pump. No one had indoor water in those days, so everybody went to the local water pump to get their water for drinking and cooking. And so he found out that a nearby cistern, because everybody dumped their sewage into a large cistern under the house where it was emptied by carts. A bit primitive, but there you go. That's how London was in those days. Anyway, that was leaking into the groundwater and contaminating the pump. So a couple of things showed. One, you could show a map that pretty definitively showed that it came from the pump. And then two, helped a lot towards showing how cholera spread. And again, reducing complex data. Here's just a paper with tables and a lot of text, and you can how you can show that fairly dramatically. It's the spread of Lyme disease, the number of cases over a 15-year period, and so you see that instantly with a map. In this case, you still want to read the paper because it's got all the details in there, but it just shows how you can come up with something pretty dramatic that shows what's going on with the data. And then this is watch duty. So again, mentioning symbology, watch duty alerts you to fires in the area where you sign up for it. It's free, incidentally, and anyone basically in California should have watch duty installed in their phone. And so you can see here, this is the fire from the summer of 2025 that burned into Chinese camp near Sonora and burned a lot of structures there. So when you're putting out an emergency incident map, you want to inform people as quickly as possible the location of the fire, and in this case, the wind direction shows where the fire is being pushed to. There's a bunch of little weather stations PG&E has put in, which have the direction and the speed of the wind or any other has temperature, whatever you want to switch it to. And so it gives you a whole lot of information at once from which you can make decisions on, what you'll do ahead of a fire. And the symbology here is pretty clear, good labels which show up clearly, showing, things like the name of the fire, place names, roads show up clearly. So you can choose a road to evacuate to or from. And so again, that just gets back to using symbology to make your map easily understandable with just a glance. And also available through Watch Duty, though I don't have it here, are evacuation maps. This one is from Fresno County. It shows in red there, again, a nice obvious color of where an evacuation order is, and also yellow where you should be prepared. And in the upper left here, you can also search for your particular address, and it'll zoom in to show you where you are in the evacuation zone. And the same is true of the watch duty map. You can do it there too. And all of this data goes into the California Office of Emergency Services, which compiles evacuation and fire locations from all over the state so that any app and even our class, our incident class, can do the same, where we'll download that data and use it. As far as community type maps, here's one I did a bunch of years ago. Created a map book for the Twain Harte Fire Department, and And it's one of the cool capabilities of Pro. We won't be doing it in this class, although we'll be making a small one in the incident mapping class where you can create a area that you want to create a whole bunch of maps, and you define the size of each map and then add in the data that it will use. So here, for instance, I put in street names and addresses, specific house addresses with labels, and then defined what the area of the map and each individual map was going to cover. And, you just hit a little button and you churn out a whole bunch of maps. And that gets back to what we wanted to do in search and rescue, which was be able to quickly create a whole bunch of search area maps for each team maps, and then quickly print them out and hand to folks so they can get out in the field. And so here, is defined the area of the index, and then shows you the maps next to it, so you can switch to those. And you can see the addresses and street names there. And then it also creates an index, a street index of each street and the address range and what map that goes to. Now, of course, all fire departments nowadays use a online map, and they get their data straight from Cal Fire or wherever. So they don't use map books so much anymore, but it's available for training and or if the electronics fail. And here's a map book I did for my job as a ranger, and I'm using this one to illustrate symbology. And so in our class, you don't always have to do it, and it's not always called for, but it's often useful to have your label color match the symbol color that locates it on the map. So here you've got a blue point symbol, and then I use a blue label with what's called a halo, that white there that allows it to contrast with whatever background you use. And the same with the database for rapids. And, Phantom Ranch rapids here, yeah, you use kind of a brown, again with the white for contrast. Oh, and incidentally, RM, that's river mile. And so that's also from a public database. That's how river runners keep track of where they are on the river by the number of miles down the river. And all of this is publicly available data. And so I just downloaded that, created a map book that would cover 2 or 3 river miles, and quickly put out about, I think, 80 maps of the entire river through the Grand Canyon. And so their search and rescue could then open up the map book, and they had a digital PDF map upon which they could draw the search segments for each team, and then also either me or whoever was their GIS nerd on the search could then take the tracks of the teams from their Jeep and put those onto a map to keep track of where everybody was and what areas they'd covered. And here's another work map that I had put together. We had a bad accident in Sequoia Kings where a research team came in. They, of course, had a radio, but they were unfamiliar with the dead zones, areas where you couldn't transmit on a radio. And so one of them took a bad fall, and they were trying to radio out, but they couldn't hit the repeater. And they didn't know which direction to go that would make it possible to hit the repeater and call for help. So after that accident, we started talking about, okay, how do we solve this? And we got together the backcountry rangers who know the area, know what rocks to stand on and what repeater they can hit. So we just all sat down at a great big park map, and everybody drew in the areas that would hit a certain repeater, and even some tiny little areas that even if you were in a dead zone or a marginal zone, there were literally rocks you could stand on top of, boulders, and be able to hit a repeater. So maybe I'm overdoing it here with examples, but here is yet another map of bike trails. And this is commercially produced bicycle trails, but it color codes according to difficulty. And notice how the base map is grayed out. What they wanted to do here was emphasize the trails themselves And as I say, their difficulty and the underlying terrain wasn't quite as important, but of course the place names are. So as you're riding your bike, that is, and that sort of thing is possible. We've had a couple of students do local mountain bike trails on the forest, and those have come out pretty good. And something that's I think there's some available online now that you can download. And for student maps, this was an extremely cool map several students did a few years back. The Columbia Historic Cemetery. They mapped it out, mapped all of the plots, geolocated each grave plot, and then to the extent they could, if they knew the name of the person and any of that person's history in the cemetery, then they created a database for each of those little dots there, and then there's the associated data record for it. And from that, they created a nice little brochure type map, story map, which has the history of the cemetery and the plots, and then it went into more depth in their online map, telling the history of some of the people buried there in the 1850s. So this was a multi-year project in several classes of three of the students. And one of the things I say, in the introduction to this class is I'm open to that sort of thing. If you have a project you're pretty excited about in another class, and or there's a few of you who want to work on a project together, I'm good. I want you to write me and tell me what it is and how each person is going to contribute to that map. I don't want one person to do it and then everybody else rides on that person, which happens a lot, of course, in classes. But in any event, send me a note. Let's talk it over. And as I say, I'm pretty open to that. And then we'll also create our own data. You can create forms which you can fill in online or on your map with Arc Pro and fill in the information. And that's what the folks with the cemetery map were doing. So they created a form and then they could fill in the information. And finally, you can use GIS for analysis. So here is what's called a cost surface model, and that estimates times of travel for various types of knowledge you might need. So this is time from a EMS, ambulance bay, or fire department to various hospitals in San Francisco, and it estimates the time, breaking the time into several 5, 10, and 15-minute breaks, and then it color codes that. So you can use that to locate future fire stations or police stations according to estimated response times. And then week 4 of the basic map class will be using what's called digital elevation models. You won't need to create one. I supply the data, but it's another cool ability of ArcGIS Pro. We'll use data that's derived from LiDAR, and LiDAR is created usually from a fixed wing that pings like a zillion points down onto the surface. And so those give a little point of light, which is then read by the plane, the fixed wing plane, and the distance measured, and then the distance calculated. And so you get a profile, and you can use the data to reconstruct buildings on the terrain, and you can show individual vegetation, the profile of the vegetation, trees, and how high it is, and then just a ground view, which will give you a pretty clear view of drainages. And in one of the week 1 assignments, I've got you guys just watching a 3-minute video of a LiDAR derived vegetation map up at Spring Gap, just off Highway 108. And it's PG&E land. And it was kind of a proof of concept. We were showing how PG&E could view a kind of a flyover, which shows the vegetation profiles, existence of various levels of flammable vegetation and how it's exposed to both power lines and their their generator facilities up there. So it's kind of cool. So take a look at that. And we won't be doing that, but I just want you folks to see what's possible with GIS. So just one more thought here. Esri, the makers of the software we'll be using, used to have a slogan, thinking spatially. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with this introduction presentation. Just letting you guys see what's possible in GIS and how you could think about applying maps and data into your job or life. But like I said, this is a basic maps class, so you'll only need to do the basics for our assignments. And I like to think I've fairly clearly described in each assignment what I expect to see in each of your maps. So meanwhile, though, just be aware of what's possible should you continue with GIS. So, okay, there you go. Thanks. And if you have any comments or questions as we go through the course, uh, be absolutely sure you get a hold of me. I'm available by email, and the best is my home email, gdurkey@sonic. But you can also use the Canvas app email to contact me, and that's automatically forwarded to me, or my college email address. But my personal email I've got on all the time, and so I see that the quickest. And I'll get back to you, assuming it's not on a weekend. And a lot of you will write me with a crisis at 11 at night on a Saturday, and I'm not going to get back to you as quick as you might hope. Anyway, thanks, and I look forward to your maps and working with you guys.